So welcome to Notes 5.5. These are about the U.S. and Vietnam and the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And that's what we're going to look at today. So we're really going to start with President Johnson. We talked about Eisenhower and Kennedy already. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, which is kind of where our last notes left off, with Diem also being assassinated in 1963. So Johnson becomes president, and Johnson needs to make a decision on what he's going to do. So we're looking at Lyndon Johnson as our next president and making this decision. He's the one who advised President Kennedy to send more advisors to Vietnam, if you remember from our last set of notes. And so Johnson really believes that we need to live up to our anti-communist worldview. So we need to do this. He thinks the North Vietnamese are being controlled by the Chinese. He's very concerned about this. And he is assured by his advisors that a small investment of troops and money mean we're going to win quickly. So looking back, we can tell for certain that is not true. But at the time, Johnson believed that. Johnson wants this war to be over. And so he, going off of his ideas from before and what his advisors are saying, sends troops to Vietnam. So he's going to increase the number of troops in Vietnam. He also is able to do this on his own because of this thing called the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So the incident happens here in the Gulf of Tonkin, in fact, right in where that little dot is. But it really leads to allowing Johnson to have more power. So what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? It was in 1964. You do not have to know all these dates. But basically what happened is it starts off with the North Vietnamese claiming they've been attacked by the South and the U.S. And the U.S. denies this, but the North Vietnamese retaliate by using torpedo boats to attack a U.S. ship that is in the Gulf of Tonkin. So notice it's right off of North Vietnam here. So the North Vietnamese retaliate. The U.S. accepts that but tells them they can't do it again. And then 2 days later, the U.S. claims there's a second attack by the North Vietnamese on them. The North Vietnamese deny the second attack. Because of this, Congress makes the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So Congress does not actually want to declare war in Vietnam. So they use this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or sometimes called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, to get around declaring war. Now, what this actually says is that the president can take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against armed forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. Okay, so you're like, what does that actually mean? Basically, what it means is the president does not need Congress to declare war. The president can declare war all by himself. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 essentially gives President Johnson the right to declare war without Congress declaring war. And what this means, why does Congress give up this power? Well, because they're not really sure the people are going to support a war. It's only 10 years after the Korean War, and we've been involved in it essentially the whole 10 years. It's 11 years after the Korean War. 10. And we've been involved in it for the whole time, and they're not sure it's really supported. So Congress is basically going to say, can't blame us, by putting it all on President Johnson. So Johnson takes this as essentially a go-ahead from Congress for his escalation plan. So from 1964 to 1967, 3 years, that's all we're talking about, 3 years, Johnson escalates the war. Escalation is to build up. He makes it bigger. So he chooses to bomb North Vietnam, which we had not done before, and to send more troops. So he has two things he's going to do. He starts a ground war where American troops are fighting. From 64 to 67 under Johnson is when we increase the draft, when we have more troops going, where a lot of the issues start to come up. By 1968, over these 3 years, we have more than 538,000 American troops in Vietnam. There were 16,000 under Kennedy. Now we're at 538,000. So you can see this huge increase in troops. Over 500,000 troops are sent by Johnson in 3 years. Most of these troops are being part of what are called search and destroy missions. The idea is that there are a lot of Viet Cong, North Vietnamese troops and sympathizers throughout the country. So Americans are going in, usually helicoptering into the village, walking into the village, clearing out the Vietnamese, killing the livestock, burning the village. They're destroying it. So they search for them, they destroy them. That's the plan. And the other piece that they have is napalm. So napalm and other toxic chemicals. And here we have some pictures of it. They drop napalm onto jungles. The troops would radio in what coordinates they needed cleared. Planes would come in and drop the napalm. It would clear out the jungles. I mean, you can see right there that it's going to burn and clear it out so that guerrilla warfare can't happen, so that it takes care of any enemy cover that they had there. Sometimes it would hit villages. That's what's happening below. This is actually one of the most famous pictures from the Vietnam War, so that's one of the reasons I put that in there. And here, this really shows you escalation. From Kennedy in 63, Johnson leaves in 68, which would be this one right here, would be Johnson's last year as president. You can see it's the highest one. So from Kennedy in 63, so here's Kennedy. You can tell Johnson escalated the troops while he was in office. So that really shows Johnson's escalation policy. So what were some of the things that happened when Johnson was president? Actually, let me do this one first. I don't know why they're out of order. So one of the things that happened when Johnson was president and that really hurt public support for the war is going to be the Tet Offensive. This happens in January and February of 1968. So early 1968, Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and it's a surprise attack on the New Year. So it's a holiday, we don't expect an attack, and the North Vietnamese, they use this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which actually goes through Laos and Cambodia and allows them, it's a supply line, but they also use it to then come in and attack at a variety of places all through South Vietnam. So that is used. These are the surprise attacks. The first couple we actually lose, but ultimately it's a military win for the U.S. because we have enough military to fight back and defeat them, push them back. But it's a political loss because with this, we have a lot of troop deaths. We were surprised. We weren't ready. It really doesn't look like we're organized, and there's a reason for the U.S. to be there. So the Tet Offensive actually hurts the U.S. even though we win the battles. Then, a month later, this thing called the My Lai Massacre happens. And this is in March of 1968. It does not become public until almost 1969. But it really causes a shift in the U.S. sentiment. It really upsets Americans when they hear about this. So this is a search and destroy mission for the village of My Lai. We knew there were a lot of Viet Cong troops in the area. They had been attacking American soldiers. Many U.S. troops had been killed and maimed recently in this area. And so we sent in troops to search and destroy in My Lai, find the Viet Cong, destroy them. And this search and destroy mission becomes an absolute massacre. And we see women, children, old people, everyone is killed. So the troops went in, again, think about the book, the things they carried, young. The lieutenant in charge of them, Lieutenant Calley, is actually the one who is held responsible for this. So he's not very old, but he gives the order and lets them kill everybody. And so ultimately he is held responsible. The individual troops are not, although some of them refused to participate, which could have led to them being court-martialed. I mean, this is a very difficult situation. Calley was being given orders from people above him, who were being given orders from people above them. So some people fought back, did not agree with it, but it was a massacre and the entire village was killed. So this is going to turn people against the U.S. being in the war. We don't want Americans, we don't want our young men to act like this. We want them to get out of that war. So by late spring of 1968, Johnson is starting peace talks in Paris. But it's a presidential election year, and Johnson is so unpopular he doesn't even run. So he could have, he didn't. And in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention, there are huge protests. All kinds of problems come up. It's in Chicago, and here you can see that many protesters wanted an anti-war platform here. You can even see specific signs for that. They're protesting. They don't want the platforms that's there. It really became violent. And because of all this unrest within the Democratic Party, Nixon, who is the Republican, won the three-way election in 1968. So Nixon becomes president, and he changes the policy. Johnson was escalation, escalation, escalation. Nixon is what's going to be called Vietnamization, and Vietnam being your important word here. Vietnamization means he wants to turn the war over to the Vietnamese. So he's going to end the conflict. That's his plan. Withdraw U.S. troops, let the South Vietnamese do the fighting. That's his plan. So he wants the partition of Vietnam. He wants the 17th parallel in two countries, but he doesn't want us to keep fighting. He's going to increase aid. He is going to increase air raids because that doesn't hurt Americans. And he has some secret plans to bomb Cambodia and Laos. And part of that, so here we can actually see Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam runs all the way along it. They are actually supporting the Vietnamese. So even though technically they're neutral, that's where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is running through. That's how they're getting supplies. Cambodia is having its own revolution, as is Laos. And so there are some issues in there. So we can see under Nixon, troop numbers go down. So you can see that happen there. So here's that idea I told you about. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is this red piece. It was used to supply troops and supplies for North Vietnamese troops from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. All of these little red areas are places that the U.S. bombed that are not in Vietnam. So they were neutral areas that we bombed. So you can kind of see what was happening. Well, bombing a neutral country, we're getting another country involved. People were upset. It leads to more protests. So with this invasion and bombing of Cambodia, the reason was to get the North Vietnamese out. But there's no congressional consent, but we had the War Powers Act of 1973. So there's some questionability about here, some questionable constitutionality about this. But it sets off general student protests and strikes across the U.S., the most famous of which is Kent State University. Because in 1970, when students were protesting the invasion of Cambodia, on campus, they were harassing some National Guard troops who were there. The National Guard troops opened fire on the students, and here you can actually see some pictures from when they opened fire and students running. This is afterwards at the top, as are the ones on the bottom. And 4 students are killed, 9 are wounded by the troops on the college campus. So, I mean, you can see in these pictures the students who were wounded and killed. So we really see it's happening in the U.S. There's so much tension in the U.S., there are problems here too. So by June of 1970, the troops were withdrawn from Cambodia because there was too many problems in the U.S. So Vietnam starts having some problems. The South Vietnamese are not very successful militarily. They're just not a very good military. There's also some really low morale among U.S. soldiers. They were drafted. They didn't want to be there. They're super young. We talked about the average age was 19. The high casualties, death rates, injuries, and the high drug use. And we see all these in the things they carried. You see all these in the book. And that just really hurts the morale and makes them not as good at being soldiers. So Nixon comes up with a new plan. His new plan is this thing called détente. See how they're shaking hands, being friends? That's kind of what détente is. Détente is this idea of relaxation of tension. So they're going to try from 1970 to 72. Nixon tries this to try to get along better with Russia and China. And if we can get along better with them, they are the two major superpowers of the communist world. That will actually relax tensions with all of the communist world. So the idea is, let's see if we can have some peace here. So in 1972, the US withdraws our troops, starts withdrawing our troops. So we have a ceasefire agreement. By 73, we have a peace agreement, and we are leaving South Vietnam. So the US is ending the war in Vietnam. Here we see some troops who are very happy to be coming home. Big announcements, all our troops are coming out, the war is going to be over. So by 1973, under President Nixon, here we've got Nixon again, we are ending the war in Vietnam. It's not quite the end of the war in Vietnam, and that's what we'll see in the next set of notes. But we're just about done with the war in Vietnam, and things are ending.